All righty, so let's give this a second. Want to say good evening to everybody, and thank you all for attending and welcome to the Campaign for Community Control. And thanks for coming to our very first live listening session. So this is currently being streamed live, but this video will be available after the stream is complete. So feel free to share it with anyone who you think may benefit from the information that we share today. Right now, I'm going to take a second. I'm going to give it a couple minutes, let some folks pour in, and then I'm going to just play some music, and then we'll get into all the things that we need to talk about today, y'all. Thanks so much. I want you to take a second and go ahead and share this link out if you haven't done so already. Go ahead and share it with friends, family, colleagues, whoever. You can text them the link, email it to them, whatever you got to do. Let's get as many people here as we absolutely can. All right, I see we got 13 folks here in the live. Let's try to get a couple more. All right, y'all. So in respect for our time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Before we get into anything information-wise, let me go ahead and introduce myself to you. My name is Imani Yassin. I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives at Parity, which is an equitable real estate development company headquartered in West Baltimore. By mission at Parity, we acquire and we renovate vacant and abandoned properties by the block in order to create affordable homeownership opportunities. But in addition to my role at Parity, I am also leading the Campaign for Community Control. And for those of you who may not be familiar with the Campaign for Community Control just yet, the Campaign for Community Control is a citywide, multidimensional effort to engage our larger community and to establish Baltimore City's first community-directed land bank as a means of addressing our city's vacant property crisis. We engage community through a number of channels. First, through educational materials and events like these. We also offer opportunities for connection and conversation, and also through the support of our local legislation to establish the city's first land bank. If you would like to get involved in the campaign and you have not already, there are several ways you can do that. The first is to sign and share our petition. To do that, you can go ahead to our website. You can take a pause and do that now, or you can write it down. And our website is www.createcommunitycontrol.org. Again, that's www.createcommunitycontrol.org. And you'll see, as soon as you get to the homepage, there's a link that says sign our petition. The second thing you can do to get involved in this campaign is to volunteer. We simply cannot do this work alone, and we need all of Baltimore City to get engaged in this conversation and in this movement to address our vacant property crisis. If you want to volunteer your time, if you have any expertise in this industry or field that you would like to share, you can again go to our website and complete our contact form, which you'll see in the top tab or in our menu on our website. And again, that's createcommunitycontrol.org. The third thing you can do is stay connected with us on social media. You can find us on Instagram and TikTok and the handle for that is @createcommunitycontrol. And then last but not least, to get involved, you can host a live learning session or an in-person learning session. So if you're working for an organization or an entity and you would like to educate your constituency or the folks that support your organization about land banks, about community control, about our vacant property crisis, you can host us again by going to our website and completing the contact form and requesting that, and we can set something up to support you in that way. But before I welcome our guest and before we get into the conversation around land banks and land banking 101, I want to give a little bit of backdrop about how severe the issue of vacant properties is in the city of Baltimore. So as many of you know who are joining this call, whether you're friends, colleagues, or working in Baltimore space or even Baltimore adjacent, you know that our city has a long history of racist housing policies, land use decisions, and investment practices, and just simply ways of operation that have resulted in inequities that so many people continue to experience to this very day. And one of the symbolic legacies of that inequity is thousands of vacant properties and lots that plague our city. The majority of those vacant properties and lots exist in Black communities and Black neighborhoods, which obviously leave Black community members, Black homeowners carrying the inequitable burden of all the issues that are related to vacancy. So here's some quick facts that I think you should know as we enter this conversation. And the first is that Baltimore City has nearly 15,000 vacant buildings and nearly 16,000 vacant properties citywide. That is insane, and it makes us one of America's top 5 cities with the highest rates of vacant homes in the entire country. The second quick fact I want you to know is that vacant properties are highly associated with crime. In fact, one data point that I wanted to share is that in 2022, 60% of Baltimore's homicides happened within approximately 100 feet of a vacant property. The third is that research consistently shows us that vacant and abandoned and deteriorated properties reduce the value of surrounding properties, right? So this leads to decreases in homeowners' equity and their personal wealth. One example of that is in Cleveland, Ohio, where properties that were in 500 feet of a vacant or foreclosed property lost 9.4% of their value. The fourth fact is that according to the cost of vacancy, which is a research report that was done by Mary Miller and Mac McComas of Johns Hopkins 21st Century Initiative, that shows that between lost tax revenue, lost water and sewage revenue, and cost of maintenance, demolition, and more, our city loses about $200 million each year through the cost of having vacant properties and lots. $200 million that could be instead invested in our communities, that could be invested in our schools, that could be invested in community organizations, et cetera. And 5 is that vacant properties are also associated with poor health outcomes, poor states of emotional well-being, poor educational outcomes, and the list continues. So we know this issue is no small problem. It's pervasive, it's longstanding, and it's extremely difficult to bear. And it's extremely, as I mentioned before, inequitable as it's shouldered by majority Black residents. So to that end, as I mentioned before, the Campaign for Community Control is a multidimensional and citywide effort who has one primary goal, and that is to establish our city's first land bank. And in order to do that, we want to make sure that the community understands exactly what land banks are, how they operate, and how they can be effective in helping us address the issue of vacancy in this city here that we live in Baltimore City. So with that said, I want to welcome our guest in just a second, who I'm looking forward to sharing with. And here she comes. She's joining us right now. Hello, Kim.
Hello.
How are you doing?
I'm well. How about you?
I'm doing well. I just spent the last couple of minutes kind of introducing our audience to the background about vacancy in the city of Baltimore. So they've been framed, but I want to give you an opportunity to just introduce yourself and tell the people who you are and why you're coming to this conversation.
Sure. Well, thank you, Amani. I appreciate the invite. I appreciate all of your leadership and learning a lot from you and supporting this incredible campaign and grassroots support around this land banking in Baltimore. So I am Kim Graziani. I am coming to you live from Birmingham, Alabama. I lived in Baltimore up until fall of 2020. So I've been here for about 2.5 years. I do miss Baltimore quite a bit. But my background, I guess, to start is my roots and my beginnings were that of a social worker. And I found myself very quickly getting very frustrated with not being able to be more helpful to my clients in addressing sort of the bigger systemic problems that were facing them. So lack of housing, lack of jobs, lack of wealth building opportunities. Basically, the systems that were supposed to work for them were working against them. So I quickly kind of refocused and started working at the community level doing some political organizing, working in various nonprofits, focusing on housing. And then I landed myself in local government in the city of Pittsburgh, which I have to say was probably one of the most transformative experiences for me. Being the liaison between the residents and the mayor, and being an organizer by trade, it was kind of interesting to be invited to these tables that as a resident, I never was. And realizing how important it is to make sure that we always share those tables between government and the residents. So that's where I was introduced to the Center for Community Progress. And I've been with them for about 12 years now, and we're a national organization working across the country, helping to deal with some of those more systemic challenges to vacancy and abandonment. So that's a little bit about me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing that. Can you tell us a bit about your role specifically as a senior technical advisor? What does that entail at the Center for Community Progress, and what supports do you offer and provide kind of on a national basis?
Sure. So since 2011, I've been with the organization. So I helped create and sort of lead our technical assistance program. And that's a program that all communities should know about. It basically provides every kind of customized assistance, from education, legal support, program support, to really work with communities where they're at and help to change laws or evaluate their laws, or work on changing practices of local government, or bringing more residents to the table that are being impacted by these properties. So I transitioned from a full-time staff to a senior technical assistance advisor a few years ago, and created my own little business called Indigo Collaborative. So I'm doing a lot of work with Community Progress and other organizations across the country.
It's no little business, Kim. Let's not play small. It's a big deal. But just to transition into obviously the reason why we're all here today, I want to start with an introduction question about what is a land bank, and kind of what is the primary purpose of a land bank, right? We're talking a lot about addressing vacancy through land banking. So can you just start by giving us some background on first what a land bank even is and what is the purpose of it?
Sure. So a land bank is a public nonprofit or authority, depending on how it's created, that is solely focused on taking properties that are causing the most harm to a community and working with local community to figure out new ownership and better uses. So the primary purpose is to have a flexible organization that is incredibly transparent, that has a lot more kind of leeway in how they acquire properties. Usually they're vacant, tax delinquent properties, and a lot more flexibility on the back end for who they sell it to, for how much, and for what use, which obviously involves community and the residents that live there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. So you briefly mentioned it has flexibility in property acquisition or acquire, which really just means like getting the property or purchasing the property. So how would a land bank go about acquiring properties? And then is there any specific criteria that a land bank will be looking for in the acquisition process?
Yeah. So the vast majority of inventory of all land banks across the country are through the tax sale or tax foreclosure process. So basically those properties that are vacant, abandoned, tax delinquent, where the private market or capitalism has rejected them. Local residents can't quite acquire them because there's issues with title and they're trying to navigate all of these different systems. And it just doesn't make financial sense to pay, thousands of dollars for a property where the market value isn't there. So they really hone in on properties that go through whatever your local jurisdiction's tax process is. So in the case of Baltimore, since you all have the tax sale process,
right?
Unfortunately,
that's another conversation.
It is. We could have a whole nother night of talking about tax sales. Basically, a land bank would be able to take properties that are going to the tax sale and instead do what's called, the wonky term is in rem judicial foreclosure. So basically, instead of selling just the debt of the property to investors who then profit off of that debt, you actually sell the property itself with clear title, which reduces a whole load of obstacles in terms of getting that property back into community supporting use. And I'd say the criteria for most land banks is, in the beginning, you really want to think about what are those short-term wins. What are the properties that everybody knows and it keeps them up at night? Obviously, our focus is on the vacant abandoned properties, but looking at kind of where is it next to a park or another project or something that, you know, has just been such an obstacle for so many years that the land bank could really prove itself and earn the trust of a community, not just through words, but through action.
It also makes me think about properties that are obviously adjacent to where folks live, right? In prioritizing, addressing those, because obviously there's so much, you know, negative implications of living next to a vacant property from the environmental aspect. We just, in our press conference, had someone who was talking about just having vermin come into her home, raccoons living in the ceiling, people kind of going in and out of the vacant property, all kinds of activity. So I hear that and certainly agree.
Yeah, and the vast majority of land bank inventory is just vacant lots, not necessarily vacant structures. So usually if it's a vacant lot, the first thing that most land banks do is they contact the adjacent property owners and say, are you interested in extending a side yard? You know, and usually there's a very small set fee, $50, $100, $200 to help facilitate that.
So as we were talking about acquisition, one of the things that came to my mind that often comes up in the conversation in the Baltimore like real estate development community is the difficulty of going through an acquisition process. Like sometimes it can take 2 or 3 years to acquire a property. So having a land bank who maybe has already done that work and that they can kind of go to get that support is something I think would be really beneficial to most people. Is that something would you agree, or what are your thoughts around that?
Would agree. And I think a land bank just is another tool to add to how people can get properties in Baltimore, right? It's not going to compete or take away properties that, let's say, the city of Baltimore is acquiring, or let's say other people are acquiring just through direct market purchases. That a land bank is not supposed to compete. What a land bank is supposed to do is to basically add extra capacity and resources to get more properties that most people don't want to deal with because they're problematic and people don't think that they're valuable. But what I always say is, I say this to the hundreds of local governments I've worked with, which is, you don't want to own the property, but even if you don't own the property, you own the problem. You still have to send your police, fire, code enforcement, all of that. So instead of having taxpayer dollars going to sort of benefit, you know, private owners, at least own the property, take control of that property and be able to sell it to a new owner.
Absolutely. And this brought up another question for me around, because we know we have thousands of vacant buildings and lots in the city of Baltimore, but the city owns such a small percentage of those properties, right? So how would a land bank get access to properties that the city doesn't currently own or hasn't, you know, is not in the tax sale process or whatever the case might be?
Yeah. So the kind of superpower of land banks is focusing on the tax delinquent properties, because most state laws, including Baltimore, give land banks the ability to get those properties quickly and cheaply. And that's kind of the value and unique niche, right? Like a land bank is dealing with properties that nobody else wants. So if they're not able to get those properties quickly and cheaply, then it's going to be a waste of money, right? They could just have somebody else do it. So if they're not tax delinquent, land banks still can do a lot of other things, right? They can accept donations. They can, you know, bid on properties. They can do direct market purchases. They can do anything that you and I can do. As long as they are transparent, they have to make sure that their inventory is made public, that their priorities of how they're going about acquiring properties and selling properties is made transparent. And again, is really vetted with the community that lives there.
Gotcha. Okay, so one thing that comes to mind is can you just give us some just basic examples of how land banks have worked effectively in other cities or in other communities? Can you just cite some examples maybe from your work at Center for Community Progress around that?
Yeah. So I would say the most successful land banks have really good working partnerships with their local governments, with the residents, with nonprofits, with everyone, because a land bank can't do it all, right? And they're really just getting the property, cleaning up the property. They're not necessarily the developer on the back end. So several land banks come to mind, but I guess one that comes to mind now that you're asking it is there is a land bank called Tricog Land Bank outside of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Of course, since I work there, that comes up to the top of my mind. And they've created what's called the Equitable Communities Collaborative, right? So basically what they've said is, we can't do it all. We don't have the resources to acquire as many properties that are vacant and abandoned. So we're going to partner with others. So they partnered with the local council of governments to do targeted code enforcement, right? To prevent properties from going into the land bank. But the best part of that is they're also partnering with their local Rebuilding Together partner, which basically for occupied properties where they don't have the resources to do whatever the code enforcement officer tells them to do, or, they're elderly on a fixed income, they actually help them provide grant dollars and access public dollars to do those renovations, again, to prevent displacement. Because while a land bank really works on the vacant property, the last thing you want, the goal isn't to displace people from their property so the land bank can get it, right? You want to keep people in their property. And then they also have a partnership. The fourth organization as part of this is the local community land trust. So for those properties that are in areas that are targeted by the City of Bridges Community Land Trust, they have an MOU between the land bank and the CLT, where they actually provide the properties for a discounted price, which helps them reduce the subsidy. So it's kind of like that full spectrum of prevention to supporting existing homeowners, to, as a last course, using the land bank and then making sure that that property stays permanently affordable. So that's a pretty good example of a partnership. I think another example of just community and resident engagement, which is always something that I try to emphasize with any community that's thinking about a land bank. A land bank in Ohio, so Lucas County Land Bank, which is where the city of Toledo is located. From day one, they had hired paid community engagement staff. This was not an afterthought. This is part of our core operations and our values and our mission. They also didn't just engage residents in volunteering their time. They actually paid residents to be part of the planning process, to actually do surveys of the properties, to help think about and dream about, what they want for that community. And I think by just sharing, not only like sharing that table of power, but also respecting people's time, having them get paid for their work, and having them actually make the decisions of where and how properties are sold and how all of this additional public funding that land bank gets is used is powerful. I'd also say, let's say Detroit Land Bank, the largest land bank in the country, 72,000 properties, right? They come up a lot. And one thing that I think is really interesting about them is they were kind of one of the first to do what's called a rehabbed and ready program.
I love this.
One of the big things is that even if you have a land bank, some of these properties are not kind of turnkey, right? And if you don't have the capital, if you don't have the contractors, if you don't have the financing, I mean, let's be clear, most people have a really hard time getting financing for rehabs, for the mortgage. So they basically have done this program where they really target properties that will require about, I think it's like $50,000 to $75,000 worth of work. And they know that they can sell it for about $150,000 to $175,000. They've created a pool of contractors that are qualified that they can rely on to do this work. And they also know that they can get the financing on the back end through a local mortgage program. So again, they're kind of creating that pipeline of vacant property, working with contractors to get it rehabbed, and then making sure that the buyers are qualified and have the financing on the back end. When local philanthropy covers the small gap that's needed, and they average about $17,000 is the gap in their financing for each property. Right. So when you think about that, $17,000 to take a property that was an eyesore causing harm to, let's say, a new first-time homeowner, it's incredible.
Yeah, and it's an investment that pays itself back tenfold, right? I think what I really loved about what you shared is that there were two things that stood out. First is the power of partnership and collaboration. So understanding the land bank's function, and then who and what entities can work in collaboration with the land bank to make it most effective, I think was key. And then the second thing, when you talk about the Detroit Rehabbed and Ready program, it makes me think about so many Baltimore properties that are in such extreme states of dilapidation, right? Where it's just so costly, to do the work. I know for us at Parity, that's something that is really difficult, is that with the appraisal gap, which is something that we talked about previously as well, is that oftentimes the cost that it takes to completely renovate the property is more than what the house is going to be appraised for once it's complete. And so it makes it really difficult for investors who really do want to work on behalf of community, who really do want to do this work and obviously at least break even, right? Yep. Or come in the green to do this work effectively. So I really love the program that you mentioned, because it creates the opportunity for maybe a developer who is just not prepared to take on that weight and that potential loss, where they can say, this is an opportunity, but at least some of the basics of stabilization and maintenance have already been complete, and it feels more doable and just more accessible as well. So absolutely.
To your point too about the appraisal gaps, I'm so glad you brought that up, because that's also one of the criteria for that Rehabbed Ready program. Is one of the goals, not the entire goal, is to create more comps in the area to address that appraisal gap, to get more properties valued and out in the market, so that hopefully in time there will be less of an appraisal gap, so more people can actually get the financing to buy and rehab these homes themselves.
Absolutely. So speaking of buying and rehabbing homes yourself, at the Campaign for Community Control, we are all about specifically community-based and community-driven decision-making about the outcomes of properties, but also providing the opportunity for people, for residents, for folks living in communities with vacancies to have some opportunities for real estate development or, property development, whatever you might call it. So can you talk a little bit about how land banks help local residents and or businesses or potential business owners who might see a property or be living in a neighborhood with vacancy and say, well, I would love to own this property, right? And I would love to do something with it. How would a land bank, or how have land banks worked in tandem with folks with those interests?
So this is another real sweet spot for land banks. I wish I can say that every single land bank did this, but not every land bank does. But we're seeing more and more land banks really recognize the flexibility they have in really engaging the residents in that neighborhood. And a lot of people ask, well, how is it different than local government, right? And the difference between a land bank and local government is that, number one, a land bank's priorities of how they make all decisions are informed by the communities they serve. So that could be in the form of having actual residents sit on the board. Every land bank has a board that is their governance structure. Even if they're not on the board, a lot of land banks have community advisory committees that literally weigh in on all of the priorities that are being set by that land bank. They also have in many of their policies that they will prioritize the residents that live in that community. Absolutely. Sometimes they're called legacy residents, sometimes they're called historic residents, sometimes they're called current residents. Like, there's all different ways that land banks have made sure that particularly residents who want to come back if they have been displaced by that neighborhood or they currently live in that neighborhood, that they have the priority. When you look at the properties that are sold, we do the National Land Bank Network, which is a part of Community Progress, we do a survey of land banks. And in the last survey, I want to say that 65 to 75%, 60 something percent of all properties sold by land banks go to community residents.
Wow.
Period.
Wow.
The next tranche goes to local or mission-driven nonprofits. I think it's less than 10%. I want to say like 7 or 8% go to private LLCs or developers. So what we see is that a lot of residents and especially nonprofits say they always get beat out by the highest bid when it's publicly sold, and or it takes a lot of time to go through the process of getting the approvals from, city council and board of estimates and others. And there's good reason why there are those levels of approval, right? I think that I'm not saying that local government shouldn't have that, but there should also be an alternative for some properties to be able to have more flexibility and to have that sort of remove that barrier of entry, right? To make it so that it's not completely overwhelming for somebody to acquire a property, to sit down with someone, to get the call back, to say that, like, we're going to walk you through this. We're here to help you. We want to know how much money you have, what resources you need. That is their sole focus at most land banks. So I think that is from all parts of decision-making, governance, to who the property is sold to, for how much and for what purpose, is how land banks engage communities and residents.
That's awesome. Want to take a second because there are people who are submitting questions that are really relevant in the chat.
Sure.
Before I get to them, wanted to say that was another thing that stood out to me in my research of Detroit's land bank, is that they have kind of a technical assistance providing like staff group that works alongside residents who are doing the development process, so that they have questions, maybe hopefully in the beginning, if they need access to financing, they can connect them, as we said before, with a community partner, maybe a CDFI, community development financial institution, for those of you who are not familiar with that term, kind of like a community-based bank that often gives loans for construction. So that people can have access and support throughout the process. But want to hop over to the chat real quick. Because you briefly touched on this, which is about nonprofits. You said that a lot of percentage of properties can go towards residents, and then another secondary percentage can go towards nonprofits. So Varia, I think, I'm sorry, is the correct pronunciation. She said, can nonprofit organizations benefit from land banks? So are there any maybe examples of that specifically? I know Parity could benefit from a land bank, but just kind of breaking that down into really simple terms from that perspective.
Yeah, so there's so many examples of it. I mean, I'd say that more and more land banks are prioritizing affordable housing as their top priority. And so, yes, there's private market developers that do that. But again, most land banks are prioritizing local nonprofits that are focused on affordable housing. So, for example, Albany County Land Bank in New York, we worked with them a few years ago. They have kind of a first look program for certain properties for the local community land trust and other affordable housing nonprofits to take a look at the property before they advertise it more broadly to others. They are willing on a case-by-case basis and or even with the CLT to do at least a 20% reduction in the price of the property to the nonprofit. They're also willing to work with, like you said, the local CDFI and others. So I'd say that most land banks, if there are local nonprofits that have capacity and really just need the property, they prioritize that. A lot of Habitat for Humanities are partners. A lot of just local CDCs are partnering with many land banks across the country. I would also say a lot of nonprofits that are working with, transitional housing or, reentry, like populations that
Mhm.
already have a ton of obstacles. A lot of land banks will work with them to give them the property and to help facilitate some of those community conversations to redevelop that property for safe, quality housing.
Awesome. Something that came up in my mind too, in listening to that, is maybe there's a nonprofit that's not, a community development nonprofit, not focused on housing and real estate development, but maybe a nonprofit who is established, maybe has the budget for a property, but needs a space, right, for their nonprofit to operate out of, or they're working in partnership with a community organization or a neighborhood council, like using some of the properties and or lots for their events or for their gathering, whatever the case might be. I think there's a lot of creative ways in which nonprofits could benefit from a partnership with a land bank. And
Yeah,
then one
and you're
other.
right.
Mhm.
It's not just for housing. It could be for, specifically targeting properties for small businesses.
Yep.
Tons of inventory is targeted for greening, community farms, addressing food deserts. So you're
Mhm.
right. It doesn't just have to be housing nonprofits. I'm just finding that is rising up to be one of the
Yeah.
top priorities, given the fact that somehow we're all realizing that we don't have access to quality, affordable housing in this
We
country.
just now figured it out.
Yeah.
Awesome. One other question to the chat that I wanted to mention that I think is a great question is, how can we fund a land bank, right? And we can talk specifically about Baltimore's land bank, and I'm sure that we can also mention examples from across the country, but how are land banks funded? And would it be possible, according to this person, to use tax sale proceeds to fund a land bank?
So there really are no restrictions for how land banks can be funded. So let me start by saying over 50% of all the land banks that have responded to our survey that we work with, which I think is pretty typical to the over 250 land banks out there, are funded through direct government grants and appropriations. That could be
Mhm.
tax sale proceeds. That can be community development block grant dollars. That can be line items in the budget. That can be whatever source of government funds. Usually it's the local government. The second kind of most common form of funding is through philanthropy. So different foundations are, giving
Mhm.
funding for programs, things like that. And then there is the tax recapture. So there are some laws that actually allow the land bank to get part of the delinquent tax proceeds for properties that they
Mhm.
sell. Unfortunately, Maryland doesn't have that yet, but hopefully we can get that in the law
Absolutely.
soon. I
Awesome.
also think what's important is that most people say, oh my gosh, government doesn't have funding. But when you think about how much money government is paying for these vacant abandoned properties, it is actually a cost savings. It's going to reduce the costs for all of these vacant abandoned properties when a land bank actually acquires it and puts it back on the tax rolls and for community uses.
Absolutely. One other great question that came from the chat is, how does a city or a place, how does a land bank get established in the first place?
So most places, there's state laws that allow any community, if they want, to create a land bank. So that's the case in Maryland. They have a land bank law. And then local government creates the land bank. So usually there has to be a local ordinance. So that's in the case of Baltimore, one
Mhm.
that was introduced in the spring, that basically says, what the land bank is for, who's going to appoint some of the board members, what are some of the priorities going to be, how are they going to get properties. So it's through both state law and usually local law. But once it's created, then it does have a lot of flexibility in kind of how it makes its decisions.
Absolutely. So what I'm going to do right now is drop in the chat the link to Baltimore's land bank legislation, because as a part of the campaign for community control, one of our goals is to get petition signatures, because currently, right now, in this moment, we're trying to get this legislation passed, which would essentially enable our at the local level for us to establish a land bank. So definitely, if you haven't seen that, go ahead and take a look at it. I dropped the link in the chat, but want to kind of move on to a couple more questions. And the first is, let's talk about obstacles. We've talked about all the great things that land banks can do and the ways that they can help community. But what are some of the obstacles that land banks face and have to kind of endure in order to be sustainable for the long term?
Well, the easy answer is funding, right? Land
Right.
banks do need funding, number one. Two, they actually need inventory. So if they don't have property, then they're not really a benefit to the community. So they really need their local government's partnership of how to get those properties through the tax process. And I'd also say they need to earn the trust of the community, right? I think a lot of times, the idea of having another public entity acquire land that is quote unquote blighted, vacant, obviously stirs up a lot of mistrust. So I think a big obstacle for land banks, which can be overcome, is to really work with the community and earn their trust in their work, especially in their first year or two.
Absolutely. I think the transparency and community involvement, specifically as it relates to property disposition, is extremely important and will be extremely important in a city like Baltimore. But one other question that came to me today actually came from TikTok. Well, it wasn't a question, it was a comment. But if that person is actually here, wanted to address it, is that a lot of times people will think that we already have issues with our local government. We already have issues with city entities. So we don't address issues with government by creating more government, more bureaucracy. So what are just your thoughts around a land bank being yet another entity that people have to navigate and deal with, and the bureaucratic nature of trying to develop properties?
It's a perfect question.
Yes,
I
yeah,
think
right.
the bottom line is that if local government is not effective, a land bank is probably not going to be all that effective. Like, this is like all boats rising. I don't quite know what that metaphor is, but like, if there isn't a close working relationship and they aren't working in partnership, both of them, I don't think, are going to be as successful as they can be. The goal of a land bank, though, is, again, not to compete or create this other entity that creates a lot more confusion, a lot more bureaucracy, a lot more politics. It is supposed to complement what's already happening, but be a much easier, flexible, sort of community responsive tool to deal with this vacant land. It is not supposed to add another hardship. It's supposed to add another resource that for many people is easier to navigate, period.
Yeah. And I think just given how many vacants we have, we need all the tools in the toolbox at play. And these are conditions that folks have to live through and deal with each and every day. So we need to, kind of facilitate every tool that we know it at least has worked in other places, I think, here in Baltimore, which leads me to my next question, which is, from your perspective as a semi-Baltimorean, we won't give you a full, stamp because you weren't born and raised. Baltimore is very, very possessive, right?
I hear that.
But I'm just messing with you, Kim. But from the perspective of what you know about land banks and your experience, why do you think, and from having lived and worked in Baltimore for several years, why is Baltimore a prime location for the establishment of a land bank?
Because there's a heck of a lot of vacant abandoned properties right now. And this isn't the blame game, right? It's not saying that this city department or this person is not doing their job. It's that there needs to be more done. And it's not just about putting more money towards local government. It's about creating and trying out new tools, period. And in Baltimore, I think we've heard loud and clear, and there's such a strong bench of just community advocates and folks that have said, listen, if you give us the property, we can actually do something with it.
Right.
We want to do something with it. We know other people who have private dollars that want to do something with it. The biggest challenge is really getting that property and making it more accessible and easier to sort of purchase, that supports the community. And that's what a land bank should do in Baltimore. And I think that's the whole intent of having this conversation, is creating another tool that will make it easier to access these properties.
Absolutely. So thank you for that. What I want to do now is kind of go to the chat, encourage folks who are listening. I see we got 28 people who are tuned in right now. and give you all the chance to ask any question that might be on your mind. It could be basic, it can be complex, whatever it is. We want to give some space for you all to kind of drop your thoughts in so that we can talk about it, we can answer your questions, and so that we can provide as much context as possible while we're here. So I'll give everyone a couple seconds if anyone wants to drop some questions in the chat. Let me go and see if I can see here. Also, if you're on the chat and you're not able to drop a question, what I will say is that you can email us right now. I have my email open, which would be contact@createcommunitycontrol.org. So again, that's contact@createcommunitycontrol.org. You can just email your question there if you have any questions. But from what I understand, there's a lot of movement towards establishing a land bank, and particularly not just establishing a land bank, but doing so in a way that's led by community, that incorporates community voice, and that is specific in its priority of focus in areas that have suffered such long-term investment and who've been the victim of so many discriminatory housing policies and practices. So want to give all those folks who might be just new to this conversation, might be just new to this information, a chance to do what we always say, which is to, add your voice in here. So I'm looking at the chat right now. Thanks, Dorian, for your question at L7ENT. I'm going to start with L7ENT. How could community stakeholders participate in the land bank governance? Now, I'm going to answer a little bit of this question because that is something that we're currently working on, and I think it's a great question. So thank you for that question. Right now, as a part of the work at the Campaign for Community Control, we are leading a few different subgroups to begin establishing some of the policies and procedures, thinking about the financing, and then also thinking about a land reclamation and stewardship academy that would support people's knowledge around land reclamation and stewardship. So let me switch to policies and procedures. We're currently thinking strategically about how to operationalize the idea of community control. And I think that the first thing we have to talk about is the fact that community isn't a monolith, right? So we know community stakeholders are varied in that there's a lot of different parties who would be at the table to make the decision. So first, it is making sure that on that governance board and on that decision-making board, it is a wide variety. There are organizations represented, there are homeowners represented, there are renters represented, the unhoused is represented, there are students represented, that it's a wide variety. The second is thinking about percentages of power, right? And from where we sit, it is that the community should have the majority stake, if you will, or equity percentage as it relates to the decision-making around disposition of property. And when I say that, it means that where will this property go? What will the outcome of this property be? So to that question, it is, and from where I sit, and Kim, I'm going to turn it over to you, maybe with some examples in other cities, it is that in our governance board, we have a variety group of community stakeholders who are on that governance board, and who will evaluate all the factors of what will be disposed of in terms of the property, and who would be essentially voting for what they think should be the outcome of that property. So I think that that's one way that community stakeholders can participate in the land bank governance. But Kim, want to turn it over to you if you want to add anything to that.
No, I think you covered it. I don't have much to add. The only other thing I would say is, I think at the beginning stage of most land banks, there's obviously a lot of apprehension and concern, right, about
Absolutely.
the governance structure, policies. Rightfully so. But I also think that you're never going to get it right, perfect, in the first round. And so that's why I think really thinking about shorter board terms in the beginning, having it in your bylaws to at least look at and have the opportunity to update priorities, policies, procedures on an annual basis, allowing much more opportunity, not just at the end of the year, to engage the residents and to weigh in on what's worked, what hasn't. Because if it isn't sort of community owned, and people can admit that, like, this is going to be an iterative thing, right? That you're hopefully just going to continue getting better and more responsive. You just got to provide opportunities to continue to kind of evolve this thing called a land bank.
Yeah, and in addition to a governance board, to that end, Kim, I think that hosting maybe opportunities just like this, right, for community to come and say what's working, what's not working, and just with any program, any entity, any organization, they have to evaluate their effectiveness and make changes when necessary. So absolutely. But want to move to the next question is from Dorian P. Is what ways can citizens get involved to help move the legislature along? The first thing is two things from the campaign for community control's perspective that you can do. And thank you for that question. The first thing you can do is sign and share our petition. I'm going to drop the link to our petition here in the chat now that I know that I can do that. Because for us, we have a goal of 15,000 signatures on this petition to establish the land bank. Also, the second thing you can do is attend the upcoming city council hearing for the bill. So that date has not been released yet. The hearing date is not out yet, but once it is out, and that's why I said for you to follow us on socials and everything else, we will share that out. Our goal is to be at City Hall in a grove of people. So those are the two things you can do. Don't just sign the petition, share it, right? Have this conversation with people that you know, especially community members who are living amongst the vacants, who want to feel like they have some power, right? That they have a choice in what's next. So definitely wanted to answer that. And Kim, did you have anything to that too that you want to say?
Show up, be heard. That's it.
Period.
You know, I think this is about creating a more open process for community control of land. And land is power. So there are many, many places where there have been a lot of apprehension about giving up that power, particularly in local government. And I like to say it's not necessarily giving up the power. It's opening up the tables of power, right?
Exactly.
And that's what elected officials and local government should be about.
Agreed. Next question comes from Ewell Rama Shaw Taylor. I'm hoping that I pronounced your name correctly. My apologies if I did not. But how does one become a member of the land bank? I think that that's a good question. I think that the word member is a little bit like, what does that exactly mean? And I think that for a community member standpoint, it is to be engaged, right? Maybe applying to be a part of the community governance board, to come to community meetings where decisions are being made from the land bank's perspective, to invite others to do that as well. But also want to turn it over to you, Kim. What are your thoughts around this question around how does one become a member of the land bank?
Yeah, so that could be defined in many different ways, but let me just focus in on Baltimore. So I think you all can define that. You're right. I mean, it could be a board member, a community advisory board member, a resident member. I don't even know if I would even use the word member. I mean, it's up to you all how you want to define that. I think as long as there is processes by which people can authentically engage with the land bank, whatever way you want to call that, then I think you got to call it that and create that process. There are definitely some land banks that have more formalized, you know, community advisory councils in neighborhoods where they work more in. So I think it could be everything from like super formal forms of membership to very informal forms of membership to everything in between. I think that's also the beauty of this Baltimore Land Bank is you all get to create this and figure out what works for you.
Absolutely. I think another thing that I just dropped into the chat is a link to subscribe. So I think another way to be a member, if you will, is to be a member of this campaign. And the way you do that and to stay involved is to go ahead and subscribe to our email newsletters. And you can also join Baltimore's Land Bank Coalition. We meet right now about once a month to talk about updates around the land bank, updates around the legislation. So if you go ahead and visit our website, you can subscribe, and then we can give you some more information around how to be a member of the current coalition. But one other question is from Chris Whalen, and it says, Baltimore City recently stated they are improving their in-rim foreclosure process. However, tax sale foreclosures for everyone else can still take years. Would the land bank going through tax sale, would the land bank going through tax sale be able to also have an expedited process? I think that that's a good question. They said Baltimore City is stated they're improving their interim foreclosure process. Tax sale foreclosures for everyone else can still take years. I think that if an individual, and please hop in and correct me from a technical standpoint if I'm wrong, right? But I think that if a land bank has already acquired the property, if you're talking about from a developer's perspective or someone who also wants to access the property, it would definitely be a much easier process because the person would be able to get it with kind of a free lien without all of the kind of difficulties that would be commonly associated with getting a property, I guess, through tax sale or whatever. So do you want to add anything to this question, Kim?
Just say that, yes, Baltimore, it's awesome that they're ramping up to do more in rem foreclosure. So I think it's going to have to be local negotiations, but I think that means that the city can ramp up, do more of those, and they could then transfer those properties to a land bank. They could also have the land bank do the in rem foreclosure if they need more capacity. So I think the sky's the limit in terms of making sure that that additional manpower is being used. But again, I think the key is making sure that the property has free and clear title on the back end, because that's going to reduce the liability to any new buyer.
I think to add to this question too, Chris, is that the city has a lot of work that it does. It's not just acquisition and disposition work that it does. And I think that one of the benefits of adding a land bank to the toolbox is that the city can focus on things like property maintenance, on helping prevent vacancy, on working with homeowners, making sure that folks can get grants to maintain their homes. There's so much work to do that I think that if there's an entity that's specifically focused on this process with a specific staff that is well funded and well staffed to do this work, that it absolutely could be a faster process. So thanks for that question. That was a great question. It tells me that you're very tuned into this conversation. So the next question in here is from Valerie Derricks, and it is, how does the land bank choose which property to purchase? Will the community have a voice in this decision? Great question, and you're welcome, Chris. So I want to kind of turn this over to you because I think you are the expert around the acquisition aspect of land banking. So how does the land bank choose which property to purchase, and will community, and I say can, because will is up to us, but can community have a say in which properties that a land bank actually acquires?
Yes, it can. So I think if you're looking at, because there's also going to be a ton of tax delinquent properties that are vacant, abandoned, and not any new land bank isn't going to be able to acquire every single one. So I think this is really where, if I were the director of a Baltimore land bank, I would say I would get the list of all of the eligible tax foreclosed properties or properties that are going through, that could go through the in-rem. And I would share that with all the communities and residents and say, help us prioritize which ones we should go for and invest resources in years 1, 2, and 3. Because it actually helps the land bank, like to actually get that input from the community itself and from nonprofits who have been looking at a certain piece of property. It's going to make sure that if they acquire it, they're also not going to be stuck with it for years and years, that there's an interest in the back end.
I love that. I think in the establishment of Baltimore City's land bank, the first year will really be about capacity building, right? Staffing, making sure we have systems in place, making sure that policies and procedures and processes are clearly lined out. And I think that community can play a role in all of that. And I also think that that entire process needs to be one that's transparent, that community is informed around. So I love that idea around having community input for priority areas as it relates to property acquisition, or priority properties as it relates to acquisition. And I think that was a great question. So thank you, Valerie, for that. But we are at the end of our questions here. Want to give anyone a last opportunity to answer questions. I'm going to go check the email again. But before we do close, and as we go ahead and address those questions, I want to say thank you to everyone who's here. I see we still have over 26 folks who are here in the live right now. So thank you for taking the time out of your schedule to support the campaign for community control, to be engaged in this conversation. For me, I will say this is for me personally, I think a lot of times in my experience of Baltimore, in my experience of what I'll say is my extended family, is that oftentimes we can talk in detail about a lot of our city's issues, right? A lot of our problems, a lot of the things that can be weighty and difficult for us to deal with. But what I love about this conversation is that it is a conversation about a solution. It's a conversation that invites everyone to participate in that solution as well. So just want to say thank you to everyone who is being a participant, and give anyone a last opportunity to ask a question. I've opened my email and I don't see any questions here, so I'm going to just refer to the chat. Chris has one last question, and it is, give or take 3,000 properties go through tax sale and don't receive bids each year. The land bank will have several to choose from. Okay, so that's not necessarily a question, that's a comment. So thanks for that. Absolutely. And then L7ENT said, do you know any specific ways a land bank can save the city money or other benefits looking from a city perspective? Absolutely. And thanks to Randy Williams for your comment. You're so welcome too, and appreciate your kind words. So back to that question, which was, are there any specific ways a land bank can save the city money or other benefits looking from a city perspective? That's a good question. What do you think, Kim?
Millions of dollars.
Hundreds of millions, right?
No, I'm not even kidding. I mean, think Baltimore City spends hundreds of millions of dollars on these properties. If they actually had another partner to be a responsible steward for these, to really get them not just back on the tax rolls, but like maintained, cared for, that will reduce the cost of the city. It will not only reduce the city's cost, but it's also going to put properties back on the tax rolls, just from a financial perspective. It's also going to maintain people's equity on that block. Like when you live next to that vacant abandoned property, the property value goes down. So I would say there was a great study done on the cost of vacancy in Baltimore. I think it was pretty conservative. And I think that most land banks, you find that they reduce the overall costs of public safety, taxes, demolitions, all of that. And they also actually bring in a lot more private and public investment.
Absolutely. So with that said, I promised folks that this would be short, that it would be sweet, and that it would be casual. And my hope is that we've delivered on all three promises. I want to say a special thank you, Kim, for taking the time out of your busy schedule to bring your expertise, to bring your energy to this conversation. It's been really helpful, and I hope that folks have been able to take something away from it.
Well, thank you all for just spending the time in your busy schedules to listen to this. And I hope to continue to be a resource. So thanks, everyone.
Absolutely. So Kim, I'll let you go, but just want to say to everyone who's still here, who's tuned in, there are several ways you can get involved in the campaign again, and I'm going to drop some links down here. You can visit our website, which is createcommunitycontrol.org. You can also follow us on social media, which our Instagram and TikTok have the same handle, which is @createcommunitycontrol. And you can please, I encourage you to go ahead and sign our petition, which again, I'll drop the link, and share the petition out with anybody who you think can benefit from knowing about this and can benefit from eradicating Baltimore City's vacant properties. So with that, I'm a Afro beat my way on out of here. And I hope that y'all have a great rest of your evening. I thank you again for participating. And thank you, Kim, again.
Sure. Thanks, everyone.
Signing off, y'all.